Welcome to the Pattern Alt series. This is a series where we're going to teach you how to fit patterns to your uniquely beautiful body. In this episode, we're going to be looking how to shorten or lengthen a wrap skirt, including the extra step you need to take if it has a frill attached to the outside seam. If you like this tutorial, you can check out madelabel.co for patterns, sew-along videos, and everything to help you create your own fashion. For today's tutorial, we're going to be working with the Buttercup Mini Wrap Skirt, but you can use this technique to lengthen or shorten any pattern that you want to. So the first thing you want to do is refer to your finished garment measurement chart. You want to look for the length measurement and make sure that you're taking it from the right spot, whether that's the top of the dress or from the waist, and figure out exactly where you need to take that measurement from. So for the Buttercup Mini, it wants us to find the place where we want the skirt to sit roughly around the belly button area. So you want to find that place on your body, and that's where you're going to start your measurement. Now for wrap skirts, it's a good idea to take it from the back of your body, especially if it has a frill, as it's going to have a crossover at the front. But always make sure that you refer to your measurement chart and pattern information, as it may specify where you need to take this length measurement. So starting from the back, you're going to measure down to where you want the skirt to finish. Now this can be a little tricky to do on your own, so you may need to get somebody to help you with this if you don't already have your measurements recorded somewhere. And once you have that measurement, you just want to write it down somewhere. An alternate way to find your length measurement is to measure a skirt you already love the length of. Measure from the waist seam. Make sure that you are measuring from the waist seam and not the top of the waistband to the bottom of the skirt, and record the length. Next, you want to compare the length measurement of your size to the measurement that you just recorded for the ideal length for your skirt or dress. So for this example, if the length from the measuring chart for the right size was 52.8, then you want to compare that to what the measurement was. So if your measurement was shorter than the one on the measuring chart, then you need to shorten the pattern by the difference between the two. So in this case, you would need to shorten the pattern by 1.8 centimeters. If your measurement was longer than the one on the measuring chart, then you need to lengthen the pattern by the difference between the two. So in this example, you would need to add 1.2 centimeters to the pattern. So now you know how much that you need to add or subtract to make your skirt the perfect length. Let's get into how to alter the pattern. If this is your first time at starting to alter patterns, you may not have all of these tools, which is totally fine. We'll tell you which ones you really need and which ones you might want to invest in the future. So starting with the French curve, this is a very handy pattern making ruler for redrawing hip or curve lines, but if you don't have one, don't worry about it for now. Next, you're going to need some Scotch sticky tape. There is a specific Scotch type that you can draw over, which makes it very handy. Then you're going to need an eraser and a mechanical or very sharp pencil. You're also going to need some paper big enough to fit behind your pattern piece. This can be wrapping paper or brown paper, anything that you can find that's big enough. Lastly, you're just going to need a clear ruler. A pattern making ruler is very handy as it has lines and seam allowances marked on it, but if you don't have one, you can just use any old ruler. And lastly, you are going to need some scissors. As is sewing law, make sure they are your paper scissors and not the scissors that you cut material with. We are using a scaled down version of the pattern so that it's easy to see everything that we do. So the first thing you want to do is find your shorten and lengthen line. On this particular pattern, we have a curved hip line for the shorten or lengthen line. Your pattern may have a straight across cut line. In both cases, the cut or shorten line should intersect at the hip point in the inner seam line. And we're going to show you how to extend or shorten your pattern using either of these cut lines. Now, if your pattern doesn't have a shorten or lengthen line, you can usually tell where that is as it's the widest part of the skirt, which is the hip line. If your pattern isn't following the contour of the body, then you might not be able to see the widest part. In this case, hold the pattern up to your body and mark where your hip line would be on the side seam. Next, we're going to show you how to draw in a straight cut line. You can use these steps if your pattern doesn't have a cut line at all, or if it has a curved cut line and you prefer to work with a straight cut line to shorten or lengthen your pattern. If, of course, you already have your cut line sorted, you can use the below timestamps to skip to the next section. So you want to start by extending your grain line, making sure it's lined up at the top and bottom of the grain line so it is straight. From there, you want to find your hip marking on the side seam, and you're going to intersect the grain line with a straight line from that hip mark. If you have a pattern ruler, you want to line up one of the internal lines on the ruler until it intersects the hip mark on the side seam. Then you want to draw a straight line across your whole entire pattern piece. If you don't have a pattern ruler, a good hack to test that you have a 90-degree angle is to get a piece of A4 paper and put the corner into the intersection of the grain line and the cut line, and make sure that is a nice clean 90-degree angle. And when you're altering patterns, whatever you do to one pattern piece, you need to do to the other. So starting with extending the grain line, the height of the pattern piece, and then intersecting that with the hip mark the whole way across your pattern piece. Make sure that the hip mark you're using on the side seam is the same distance from the top of the pattern on both pieces. If you are redrawing a straight cut line on one that already has a curved hip line, just use the point that it intersects at the side seam to draw your straight across cut line. Now, a reason that you might want a curved hip line rather than a straight cut line is if you are transferring this to a toile or sample, the hip line is going to sit straight across your body, so you'll be able to see if it's sitting in the right place and also sitting straight. So once you have your hip measurement marked on the side seam, from the top of the skirt, use that measurement and then continue to measure the entire way along the skirt panel, keeping your ruler fairly straight at the top of the skirt whenever you're measuring down. These dashed lines are going to join to draw your curved cut line. Grabbing your French curve, you're just going to join those marks with a smooth curve line. If you don't have a French curve, you can just do this line freehand. It can be handy to add a few extra dash lines in just to make sure that your curve is nice and smooth. And that is your curve line complete. Remember, whatever you do to one panel, you must do to the other. So just repeat the process on the front skirt panel. So next we're going to be lengthening the pattern pieces, starting with using the curved cut line. So starting with the front skirt panel, we're going to draw a line on a piece of paper that is going to fit your whole skirt pattern piece on top of it. You want to make sure this line is vertical down the middle of the page and perpendicular to the top of the page. This is where a pattern ruler really comes in handy because you can just line things up. You then want to get your pattern piece, and we're going to extend the grain line down the entire height of the pattern piece, making sure that it is really lining up at the start and end of the marked grain line and it is very straight. Once you have that drawn in, you want to come back to your shorten or lengthen line, and you want to cut along that line. You're then going to tape the top part of the pattern onto the piece of paper, making sure that the grain line that you extended lines up perfectly with the line that you drew on the paper. And you want to stick that down really well. Then it's time to lengthen the pattern. So however much you want to lengthen your skirt by, you're going to add that measurement the entire way along the pattern piece. So you want to line your ruler up with the start of the pattern and just make sure that you're measuring straight down as you go along. For this pattern, we're going to be extending it by 1 centimeter as it's a scaled down version. But you would just be adding however much you want to extend your skirt by. So this is going to create a dashed line, and once you finish creating that dashed line, you're going to line the bottom piece of your skirt up with the dashed line. Starting with the grain line, you're going to again make sure that it is lined up at the top and bottom of the grain line, and then stick everything in place. And you can come back and do a quick check, making sure everything is even. The golden rule of altering your patterns, whatever you do to one, you do to the other. So we're going to jump into the place where you've already drawn the line down the middle of your piece of paper, extended the grain line, and cut along that cut line. So once it's all taped down, you're going to do exactly the same thing, extending by however much you did on the front of your skirt panel on the back side, the whole way along the cut line. Again, you're then going to line up the bottom part of your pattern piece, making sure that the grain line mark is lined up and also your place on fold line. Next, we're going to be lengthening with a straight cut line. Now this can be a little bit of a quicker process, so if you like speed in your sewing, then this may be the technique for you. So exactly the same as the curve line, you want to draw a perpendicular line down the middle of your piece of paper and line up your extended grain line from the pattern with that line. The only difference being that it's a straight cut line instead of a curved one. And the same steps again, we're going to lengthen by how much longer you want your skirt to be. Obviously this is a lot easier with a straight line, so you can mark directly down how long you want to extend your skirt by, and you would really only need 2 marks and then draw a line. If you are working on a place on fold pattern piece, you can extend that side line to make it easier for everything to line up. Otherwise, you can just make sure that your extended grain line is in line with the top and bottom of the line on the page, and then stick everything in place. And you would use these exact same steps on your other skirt panel. And you can see that whether you're using curved or straight lines, you're going to have a very similar result. So it's up to you which technique you prefer. As you redraw the seam lines, it's very important that you start from the top and work towards the bottom, and you should never trim any excess off the pattern, as this can result in your hip area being too tight. So let's move on to redrawing the seam and hemlines. So again, starting with the front skirt panel, we're going to redraw in this side seam. So when you're redrawing seams, you have to remember to go hip to hem, and you only ever want to add to the pattern, not ever trim any off it, or this can make the skirt too tight. So pulling out your French curve, or you can hand draw it, you just want to, from the top towards the hemline, make a smooth curve, and you should just have a little additive on the side of the pattern. And you want to use the same technique on the other side. Use your French curve or hand draw a smooth line, and you should always be adding to the pattern to make the line smooth and never trimming away from it. And on the back skirt panel, you're going to use the exact same technique using your French curve or hand drawing a line from hip to hem. The aim of this is just to have a smooth line that feels that it flows from the top of the pattern. And if you need to use your eraser to draw in a couple of lines before you get one that feels correct, then go ahead and do that. And once you have everything all cut out, you should have your front and back skirt panel pieces that have your extended section in there. If you're just doing a regular skirt without a frill on the outside seam, then you would be complete lengthening your skirt. But for this one, we are going to need to also lengthen the top frill or flounce. So however much you added to your skirt is what you need to add to the end of your frill. Now you can use the scrap paper that you've used from your last project to make sure that you don't waste too much, as we only need enough to add on to the end by whatever you extended your skirt by. So you want to make sure that you're adding it to the very end of your frill and not an inside seam, and you're just going to tape it so that we're going to add whatever measurement you extended your skirt by to the end of the frill. So using the same technique, you're going to measure up however much you extended your skirt by. In this case, we're going to be using 1 centimeter along the top of the frill. This is a fairly straight line, so you don't need to do too many dashed lines. Then you're going to join those dashed lines, and either with your French curve or you can just freehand it, you're going to extend your frill out to that line. And once you've cut away that scrap piece of paper, you're going to have a frill that is extended, and your whole skirt will be ready to make in a longer length to perfectly fit your body. If you have a back or bottom frill, you don't need to worry about this piece at all. For those of you out there that are a little more on the petite side, then we're going to be shortening the pattern. And we're going to start with a curved cut line. So you want to start by extending your grain line the whole height of the pattern on both the front and back skirt panels. You're then going to cut along the shorten and lengthen line. And we're going to be starting with the front skirt panel. So from here, you just want to then measure up on the top half of the pattern piece, however much you want to shorten your skirt by. In this case, again, we're going to use 1 centimeter. And once you have your dashed line drawn, you're going to line up the grain line first, and then you're going to line up the rest of the bottom of the pattern piece with that dashed line the whole way along. And once you're happy with the placement, you can just tape everything down. At the seam and hemline, you're going to have the little mismatched edges that we're going to redraw later. Next, we're going to move on to the back skirt panel piece. So you should have your grain line already extended on your pattern piece, and we're just going to chop along the lengthen or shorten line. And exactly the same way as you did on your front skirt panel, you just want to measure the same distance that you took off your front skirt panel pattern piece on your back skirt panel pattern piece. So again, you're going to get the bottom of your pattern piece and line it up along that dashed line. Your grain line should be straight, as should your place on fold line, and you should have a little edge that we will redraw later. Shortening your pattern using a straight cut line is very similar to what you have done to shorten it using the curved cut line. So starting off, you just want to extend your grain line. You then want to cut your pattern in half across the straight cut line. Then the same way that you did along the curved line, you're going to measure up how much you want to shorten your skirt by. Of course, on a straight line, this is much easier, so you just really need 2 points and then join the line. You're then going to line up the bottom half of your pattern on the top half, lining up the grain line, and if you're working with a place on fold pattern piece, you also line up that place on fold edge and tape in place. And no matter which technique you use, you are going to end up with exactly the same result. And you should have a little bit of a ledge on your side seam, which we are going to redraw next. So the same as when we were lengthening the skirt pattern, whenever you're shortening it and redrawing the side seams and hemlines, you want to go from hip to hem. So you want to get a piece of paper that fits behind your pattern piece and stick your pattern on top of it, as we're going to be redrawing these hem and seam lines, adding the extra space from hip to hem to ensure that we are never subtracting width from the hip, as that can make the skirt too tight. Again, you want to start from the top and work your way down towards the hem, creating a smooth line, and you can do this with either your French curve or you can just slowly hand draw the line in. And you can see that we've just added a little bit to the pattern to make that line smooth. And we're going to do the same thing on the back skirt panel piece. Starting from the top and working our way down, always adding to the pattern and never trimming off. And you can use your French curve or hand draw that line in until you are happy with it. Then you can go ahead and finish cutting those pattern pieces out. And if your wrap skirt doesn't have a frill attached to it, then you would be complete shortening your wrap skirt. If you have a frill, then keep on watching. So just taking off whatever amount you shortened your skirt by, you're just going to measure in from the top of the frill. You want to make sure that it is the very top of the frill and not an inside seam. So marking whatever you took off from your skirt, you're just going to join that line up and then snip it off, and it's as simple as that. And once you've snipped off that extra little bit of frill, you are going to be completely done shortening your wrap skirt, and you don't need to worry about doing anything to the back frill if you have one. And that is the end of this episode of Pattern Alt. I hope that you have enjoyed watching along. Please come and visit us at madelabel.co and continue to spread creativity and create your own fashion.